Morning, everyone. Today, we would like to present our research in the Conference of International Economic Association. I'm Teguh Dartanto, and my second author is Keanu from the Department of Economics, University of Indonesia, and also the co-author coming from the Institute for Economic and Social Research, University of Indonesia. Today, we would like to share our research result titled A Dream of Offspring, 2 decades of international economic mobility in Indonesia. Kenyans, please.
Hello. So it is a truth that's universally acknowledged that individuals desire to achieve higher living standards and that parents desire their children to achieve even higher living standards. Indeed, the promise of a better life is one which governments around the world promise and pledge to their people. Yet, recent evidence finds that despite the massive progress towards equal access to opportunities, intergenerational mobility has stalled all around the world. In general, there are 2 ways to measure intergenerational mobility: absolute mobility and relative mobility. A low absolute mobility signals low improvements in living standards, while a low relative intergenerational mobility implies that privilege and poverty are highly persistent across generations. Considering the central role that intergenerational mobility has on welfare, inequality, and growth, it is important to understand the recent trends in intergenerational mobility in the context of developing economies. Our study explores both absolute and relative mobility and distinguishes between strong and weak mobility. As a diverse country undergoing major economic, social, environmental, and political upheavals, and as a country with a burgeoning middle class, Indonesia's story is uniquely suited to exploring the patterns of and relationships surrounding intergenerational mobility in the past 3 decades. This research therefore exploits 3 main research gaps. The first is the scarcity of intergenerational studies in developing countries such as Indonesia. Second, and related to that first research gap, instead of following the conventional routes of measuring mobility through income and education, we use consumption expenditures as the measure of welfare and mobility. Third, we also consider the possible non-linearities in intergenerational mobility across different quintiles, and we employ the novel unconditional quintile regression in order to acquire better and more interpretable results regarding covariates. We used mainly the 1993 and 2014 waves of the IFLS to measure intergenerational expenditure mobility in Indonesia. The IFLS is a longitudinal survey in which the sample of households in subsequent waves are primarily determined by the household sample in the first wave. The 2 decades between 1993 and 2014 saw massive poverty reduction in Indonesia and are therefore rich with intergenerational dynamics. To measure in absolute mobility, we follow Chetty's approach, and weak and absolute mobility differ only with regards to the equality symbol. Meanwhile, to calculate relative mobility, the intergenerational expenditure elasticity is obtained by regressing log child income on log parent income, whereas the rank-rank slope is obtained by calculating the correlation between the child's position on the quintile rank on the expenditure distribution and their parent's position on the distribution. When the elasticity and slope are higher, intergenerational expenditure mobility is lower because elasticity and slope represent the intergenerational persistence in expenditures. Estimates for intergenerational mobility are obtained by taking 1 subtracted by the IGE, or the intergenerational elasticity. Finally, we also conduct unconditional quintile regressions to identify non-linearities in the intergenerational mobility across the expenditure distribution. To do so, we take the recentered influence function. The results for the percentage of the population experiencing upward intergenerational mobility show that the differences between weak and strong mobility are highly sensitive to the number of quintiles used in the analysis. Because the weak and the strong measures of mobility converge near 50%, it is evident that there is less absolute intergenerational mobility than it would seem in the total population. Almost half of the population remain stuck in their position or even fall lower than their parents on the distribution throughout the past 2 decades. Low mobility indicates that despite the decline in poverty, the economic pie has not grown significantly for the country. However, absolute mobility also declines as parental expenditure increases, with absolute mobility being highest for the poorest and most vulnerable groups at the bottom of the distribution. This is a favorable result, as it implies that the low mobility which exists in the overall population is less prevalent among the poorest groups who are in the greatest need for upward mobility. Turning to relative mobility, this figure illustrates the long-run transition of relative intergenerational consumption mobility between parents and their children. Around 9.29% of children whose parents were in the first quintile were able to climb up the economic ladder to the fifth quintile during the 2 decades. However, only 35% of children whose parents were in the highest quintile were able to maintain their consumption at the same level as their parents. This shows that mobility of children is highly dynamic in Indonesia, but with significant downward mobility alongside upward mobility.
Yeah, thank you, Kenyon. I would like to continue our presentation to show the regression result from the logit estimation. And in general, our estimation, logit regression result for weak and strong mobility have a similar coefficient, or the size of coefficient, and also the similar significance. But the most interesting one in our absolute mobility regression, we find that the parent living in urban areas and increase in parents' years of schooling reduce the probability of absolute mobility. And the parent location has a negative coefficient, while the child household location has a positive one. This is maybe the case that children born in the rural areas have a greater chance for upward mobility. This is because of rural development and also expanding equality of opportunity to access basic services such as health and education, and this may have enabled them to move out of poverty. But the result also indicate that children living in the urban area means that they are already growing up, and then they live in urban area, have a greater chance for upward mobility, implying the rural-urban migration might play a part of the raising welfare. So this is, I would like to show in the absolute regression, children's, those who are born in the rural area have the higher mobility, and those children already moved to the living in the urban area will have a greater chance to upward mobility. Then we also estimated the relative mobility using the unconditional quintile regression, using the both expenditure and also the rank regression. And we found that the relative mobility is higher than the absolute mobility. This is due to the decrease in inequality between the 1993 to 2014. The coefficient for intergenerational elasticity is markedly low in comparison to estimate of other intergenerational elasticity in Indonesia, such as Hertz suggests that an intergenerational education elasticity for Indonesia is 0.78 for Indonesia, with the rank slope is 0.55. But our estimation is lower than this finding. So we shown that the intergenerational mobility in expenditure in Indonesia range from 0.81 to 0.88. But from our rank regression, find that the intergenerational mobility range from 0.75 to 0.92. This is shown that the elasticity indicate that between 8% to 20% of children expenditure are determined by their parents' expenditure. But this is the interesting result from our unconditional quantile regression, that we found that the mobility, the relationship between the parent and children, the shape is U-shape. This is similar to finding in the United States. This is slightly good, the U-shape. This is desirable in the effort to reduce poverty, but the U-shape with the lowest mobility for the middle class implies a possible middle income trap. This is, we have to concern, the government have to concern about this. So the low mobility and high persistence for the middle class family might indicate the possibility of threat. So this is from the micro level data, we can predict in the future Indonesia maybe face possibility of the middle income trap. So for our study using the econometrics study, then we check several robustness check to confirm that our result is also consistent. So our estimation shown that intergenerational mobility results are largely robust, falling around the same range. And we also controlling with some additional covariates. So we are also controlling with the additional, for example, including the social assistance and also using the income as dependent variable. And you can see that the range of the intergenerational mobility is, the range is not much difference between each other. So lastly, and this is our conclusion, that the improving of the living standard throughout the past 2 decades in Indonesian economy has allowed millions of households to break free of the poverty. This has resulted in diverse dynamic of intergenerational mobility in Indonesia. So 9.28% of parents in the lowest quintile were able to have their children climb up to the highest quintile. The usage pattern generally confirms that children are more mobile as they are unconstrained by their parent fortunes, especially at the lowest and highest expenditure distribution. However, the usage pattern also reflects intergenerational persistence in the middle class group that may indicate the possibility of the middle income trap in Indonesia. However, while our study presents several important variables with the effects pattern of intergenerational mobility, but we do not claim strong causality due to the possibility issues of indigeneity. Even though this is, we don't claim the causality, but this is very important study to show about the condition in Indonesia and the mobility in Indonesia. So we leave these issues of the causality for the future study to deeply explore the causality between one indicators to other indicator. So we hope that the central theme of our study highlight the needs for government not only deliver the wealth of nation, but to also deliver the wealth of the future generation. And then thank you very much. We are often to get the comment, suggestion for all of the audience. Thank you very much.